My name is Kenneth Frampton, and I'm the author of a newly published book titled The Other Modern Movement, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Joining us today is Inga Saffron, the Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture and design critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Later on, it's architecture commentary from our own special Gen Z correspondent, Louisa Whitmore. And now, your host, certified baby boomer, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. You know, it's totally out of fashion to be a baby boomer these days. While the OK Boomer meme has thankfully faded out of public use for the most part, I can't say as a baby boomer that it's undeserved. My generation has not been the most responsible in helping the next couple of generations along. According to the website Ranker, the baby boomer scorecard is pretty bleak. We've partied too hard and divorced too many times, sending the kids we coddled into a spin cycle with their own romantic relationships. Boomer Democrats and Republicans alike ruin the economy through excessive borrowing and deregulation. Except for Al Gore, baby boomers and their parents were fast to deny climate change. British baby boomers voted for Brexit, while 75% of UK voters 18 to 24 voted to remain. And as Dr. Phil would ask, how'd that work out? Not so well. The country has lost billions. Baby boomers drove up the cost of university education and created a huge class of people who either have massive debt or no longer value the broader worldview college gives. We're consistently ranked as the most difficult age to deal with, even worse than our parents born in the 20s and 30s. And as boomers, we pine for the past, when most of that past was at the expense of minorities, immigrants, and women. If the epidemic of obesity continues, millennials will be the first generation to die younger than their parents. Not because of laziness, it's the food full of sugar and additives. About 1/4 of baby boomers don't even use the internet and still treat it like some kind of bothersome fad. About half of Donald Trump's supporters are 45 to 64 years old. So depending on your political party, that's a great thing or a really bad thing. And finally, the worst thing, the thing that has our children and grandchildren pick up their phones and start scrolling, we just love to rant. Just like this.
Yeah.
Ranting, it makes me hungry. So I'm going to go to lunch now at Whole Foods. It's a start. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In a classic tale that we are largely making up, modernist realtor Angela Roll worked her way through college, dancing like no one's watching to Mambo No. 5 and brilliantly house-flipping Neutra houses, sometimes simultaneously. At 22, following a celebrity-filled party at a famous hillside modernist house in Los Angeles involving late-night swimming, fig-infused goat cheese, absolute lime, and a new use for WD-40, Angela was recruited to architecture school. There, she spent years in sleep-deprived design studios. Now she's a modernist real estate agent with specialized design training, advising buyers and sellers on everything, from appropriate renovation to staging a martini party for 200 people from 2,800 miles away. That last sentence is 100% true. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL, or call 919-995-0550.
Thanks, Tom. Design critic Inga Saffron has been called the Philadelphia Inquirer's most feared columnist. Raised in Levittown, New York, she always wanted to be a newspaper reporter, and her first beat was the Girl Scout newspaper. She attended NYU, studied in France, and settled in Dublin, Ireland, writing Irish publications and working for Newsweek. Joining the Inquirer in 1984, from 1994 to 98 she was their Moscow correspondent and covered the Yugoslav wars and the First Chechen War. Since 1999, she has written an architecture criticism column titled Changing Skyline, winning multiple awards including the Jean Bird Urban Journalism Award, the Vincent Scully Prize, and the big one, the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism. Here's my conversation with Philadelphia's Inga Saffron. So before we get started about architecture, I want to ask you about something else.
Oh, sure.
About caviar.
Okay.
I've never had caviar at all. I've missed it somehow. I've never had it.
Oh, really?
And you're an expert on it. You wrote a book on it.
Yes.
So introduce me, the novice, to caviar for a moment.
Oh, boy. Well, I did write a whole book on it. It's fish eggs. Caviar is fish eggs.
Okay.
And every fish, lays some kind of eggs. But the ones that became most prized historically are from sturgeon. Sturgeon are these really ancient fish that evolved along with the dinosaurs and survived. Unlike certain other fish, sea bass evolved much later. I've
had sea bass. Yeah, that's pretty good.
So I'm just saying those bony fish.
Yeah.
Those flat, smaller, bony fish, which are more efficient, evolved later. But anyway, the sturgeon are very ancient and they're kind of this cumbersome, lumbering beast. They grow very big and they have very large egg sacs. Anyway, they exist only in this band of the northern hemisphere. I mean, they used to range more widely, but like everything else on our planet, their range has been constrained. But there were a lot of sturgeon in the Caspian and the Black Sea.
Yeah, the Russian caviar is one of the top sort of brands, right?
Yeah. So Russians and Greeks as well, and all Orthodox Christians really love caviar and sturgeon. And that's partly because they're all in that sort of general vicinity of Russia, Greece, Ukraine, parts of Central Asia. But more than any other Christian religion, they had a lot of fasting rules, days they couldn't eat meat.
Yeah.
And so they would let them eat caviar.
Really?
On those days. So it started out as a kind of penance. You couldn't eat meat, so you ate sturgeon, you ate fish, you ate caviar. It was a poor people's food. But then, it was discovered by the wealthy and fancied up. And
it became very elitist. Really?
Yes. So you say the word caviar and it's immediately associated with glamour. And that really happened in the 19th century when it made this transition from this food of penance to a food of luxury and indulgence. And that was partly driven by new forms of transportation, like the train, an understanding of refrigeration. Could be exported to Paris. People in Paris fell in love with it. It went really well with champagne, as well as vodka. So there was a craze in the late 19th century, and it, extended to the U.S. There are sturgeon in the U.S. There's sturgeon in North Carolina because the Atlantic sturgeon range quite widely. Anyway, so there was a craze in the 19th century, and as always, we practically destroyed the species. And then the craze faded, and then the species have rebounded a bit. So there's still the Atlantic sturgeon still produces caviar, and there's a Pacific sturgeon, which is in better shape. And there's Mississippi sturgeon, which are sometimes called paddlefish or hackleback. In the Missouri River, all the rivers of North America had sturgeon and caviar. There's a lot of sturgeon farming. People still love caviar. But you can eat the roe of other fish, like salmon roe is very delicious.
You see it a lot in Japanese restaurants.
Yes. And trout roe and all kinds of roes. I love it. Although I hardly ever eat it, especially black caviar, sturgeon caviar. It's just, the prices are crazy. But when I did my book, I had to suffer for my research and eat a lot of caviar. I wrote that book because I had spent 4 years in Russia. Before I became the architecture critic, I was a foreign correspondent for the Inquirer. I was based in Moscow for 4 years. It was during the transition between the Soviet Union and, Russia. There had been under the Soviet Union this very disciplined cartel that ran the sturgeon industry. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the cartel. And it was a free-for-all. And there was incredible poaching and trade in caviar, and I had my own personal black market dealer who would deliver to
Was his name Kyle? It seems like all the good drug dealers are named Kyle.
Well, in Russia, they're all called Mohammed or Mahmoud or something like that. And I would get like a kilo of caviar for $100.
Not bad.
Yeah, no, it was crazy. And I didn't really understand what was going on, but I strongly recommend everyone should have caviar at least once.
Well, it's on my list of things to do.
Yeah.
Inga, one of the things that I notice about your writing, maybe more so than other architecture critics that I've come across, is that you have this really deep care for Philadelphia, like you're its mom.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, or I think that's perceptive. So I've been doing this job for a little over 20 years. And, I started at, when media was in a very different place, when newspapers were in a very different place than they are today. But the problems that legacy newspapers have now were certainly beginning at that time. And if you think back to the year 2000, there were still like lots and lots more architecture critics working for newspapers and magazines, and there were big budgets, and people would like go jetting off to the latest opening of the latest architecture building. And, the Inquirer didn't really have the budget for that anymore. But also beyond that, it seemed a little less relevant to Philadelphia. I mean, you might remember 1997 was the year that Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Bilbao opened, and people went crazy over that.
Oh, sure.
And every city in the world wanted their own version of Guggenheim Bilbao. Philadelphia wanted that too. But
you got Rocky on the Steps, I think you got instead.
We got that, right. We did get a Frank Gehry building sort of in the end. But, the Inquirer didn't really have the money. The kind of readership we had was, I call them civilians. They had a kind of generalist interest in architecture. And the other thing that was happening when I was starting out was, Philadelphia was in a really bad place. The city went through a lot during the period of deindustrialization in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And, people were really ready to write the city off. And there was no spectacular architecture being built here. There was hardly anything being built at all. And I realized early on I would have to be a different kind of critic, that I didn't really have the luxury of just writing about glamour buildings. And I felt that what I could do that would be meaningful would be to sort of broaden the definition of what an architecture critic was and write more about urbanism and policy and process. And by process, I mean the political process. And that led me down this road of writing about buildings and places, but in a much broader way than pure aesthetics.
Right. It's like you're sitting in on many of the community meetings that you reported about, looking at it from that level, how people are relating to their neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So Philadelphia, I always say, is like the world's biggest small town. And everything is very intimate and local here. And we have all these like neighborhood councils that weigh in on various projects. So, yes, I went to a lot of night meetings and was very much in the trenches as these projects were discussed. That sort of shaped how I covered this beat. And Philadelphia really suffered a lot as a city, and it really began its comeback coincidentally, like in the late 90s when I started. And it was just beginning to reawaken. And that was very, very exciting. And like a lot of cities, it was very prone to making some really terrible design choices and urbanist choices.
Tell me about some of those bad choices, because, we've certainly
bad choices.
We've certainly had them in this area. I mean, like in the 70s in Raleigh, they paved over the main street downtown and built an awful civic center at the end. And of course, that didn't improve a thing. And then 30 years later, they ripped it all out and built a new civic center.
That's a very typical story.
I guess you had things like that in Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's a very, very typical story. Many, many cities, they just went crazy, and they didn't really understand why cities are attractive to begin with. So we can blame the modernists a little bit for that because they wanted to reinvent the world. But Philadelphia, I would say, was lucky in some respects. It's, of course, one of the oldest cities in America. And, a lot of horrible things happened in the 60s and 70s. We rammed an interstate highway along the waterfront, which is like the birthplace of America.
You're right.
We'll just put a highway here.
You did bury it a little bit, didn't you?
Barely. It's a little bit submerged, but they only half submerged it, which is the worst of both possible worlds. And they're actually trying to cap a portion of it now, but we rammed highways through. We actually tried to ram more highways. Fortunately, they got stopped. We have this incredibly humane and walkable street grid with all these, wonderfully scaled row houses and, exquisitely crafted banks and museum buildings and hospitals and all these institutional buildings. We had great European immigrants who came at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, brought these wonderful stonemason skills, and we just have incredible buildings here, a building stock. The good part is we didn't destroy it all. We didn't put a civic center mall. We did do Independence Mall. We did a lot of terrible things. We did tear down a lot of buildings, but we didn't destroy everything. It's nowhere near as bad as Boston, for example. Boston tore down like 90 acres of its downtown. So you asked what were the terrible things that were done as the city recovered. And so in the 90s, there was a very strong mayor here named Ed Rendell. And he realized that, we had lost all this population and all these jobs from deindustrialization. And he said, we got to figure out a new industry for Philadelphia. And like a lot of cities, he focused on hospitality and conventions and tourism and getting suburbanites to come downtown and go to the theater and go to restaurants. And the policymakers became convinced that we needed more parking. This will sound familiar.
Yes.
There was a big rush in the late 90s to build more parking garages, to build more hotels. The hotels were good. To build a big convention center downtown. To build those garages often meant tearing things down. And often you have this wonderful walkable street and you stick like an open deck garage in the middle of it. And it's really not nice. And it's dark most of the time. So I used to joke that I was the garage critic because I wrote so many columns about parking garages and why we shouldn't build so many and how they should look and why we shouldn't tear things down. So that was one of our big mistakes, believing that, we needed these garages to get people to come into the city, which I think, we already had plenty of parking. And certainly you don't need a parking garage next to every single destination.
Right.
We're also blessed in having a really good transit system that connects us to the Pennsylvania suburbs and to New Jersey and New York.
You've got Amtrak. You've got that wonderful train from the airport.
Oh, yeah. We have this legacy network, and it is really amazing. It could be obviously much better if they ran the trains more often. So the thing about parking is, it's a very chicken and egg thing. Like, do you need to improve your transit system first and then get rid of the cars? Or do you, which goes first? So I wrote a lot about that. So I kind of became a transit writer. People might not think of an architecture critic as someone who writes about transit issues, but I wrote a lot about them because the transportation network
really affects everything.
Yeah, I always compare it to computers. It's like the software that impacts how the computer functions. In the same way, the streets and the transportation influence how we design buildings. And so I wrote a lot about that. And in those early days, people were befuddled. They would say, like, you're an architecture critic. You're not supposed to write about parking garages. But I realized that, you couldn't explain why designs turned out to be a certain way unless you acknowledge that.
And you really took on more of an urban planning perspective than looking at something building by building by building.
Right. I always tried to use design as the foundation for everything I wrote because, there are a lot of different kinds of reporters on a newspaper, business writers, food writers who might come at the same story, but from a different point of view. And mine was always grounded in design issues.
You've taken on a lot of sacred cows in your time writing, and I'm paraphrasing here. Anything short of total adulation is blasphemy. How did that apply to the buildings that you reviewed? Did people just think you were crazy for not liking a particular building or for liking one?
Well, I was accused of negativity, but as the city began to recover, there were a couple of competitions, I guess you could call them. They weren't design competitions, they were developer competitions. So the city owned a lot of vacant land, and they would, have a competition to choose a developer. And one of the early ones was for a large condo building on the one of the main streets in the center of the city, with a theater and some retail in the ground floor. And it looks like a Pepto-Bismol bottle.
Okay. Pink, I guess.
Yeah. So I wrote this quite negative, and I like to think funny review about the Pepto-Bismol tower. It is really pinkish. They claim it's meant to be red. It's meant to reference brick. Of course, it's cast concrete.
Yeah.
It has a 1920s mansard style roof, but of course it's not made out of, there's no copper or anything on the top. So I wrote a kind of scathing review, which appeared on October 30th of that year. And the headline writer called it Nightmare on Broad Street. So it was a fun review, I must say. But people were outraged, like, don't I understand, how desperate Philadelphia is, and by criticizing this effort to redevelop this big important site, I was like ruining the city's chances of revival.
Wow, you really have some power there.
Yeah, but one of the things I wrote in that review was, it's not just enough to redevelop, that we had to be thoughtful and design well. One of my criticisms of that building, besides the materials and sort of the retro design, was they had the garage entrance on this main street, a huge gaping maw of a garage entrance. I criticized that as well. They had a lot of crazy things in that building. They changed the color of the window frames partway down. It was badly designed. And I felt because it was a public project where the developer got the land for practically nothing, and that it was a city agency that managed the competition, that if the city government isn't going to demand higher standards, who will? Developers won't.
Well, let's talk about developers. You recently reviewed 2 buildings in Philadelphia. I believe one of them was very appropriate, 3 stories, well designed, fit into the community. And another one was 7 stories, big monster, kind of, off by itself. And there's a lot of angles to talk about this, but what struck me right away are some of the criticisms that people leveled against the well-designed one.
Oh, yeah. That's a very sad story. I picked those 2 buildings because they were being debated kind of concurrently and in different neighborhoods. But also, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know there's a big conversation going on right now in cities about density and affordability and the connection between those two. So I think the headline had something like good density and bad density. And the building I thought was good was in West Philadelphia, which is near the University of Pennsylvania and Drexel. It's a neighborhood with a lot of 6-story apartment buildings that were probably built in the 20s, for students or teachers or, whatever. It's also a wonderful, has all this wonderful Victorian housing, single family housing. So it has a legacy of these very nicely scaled small apartment buildings. And the original proposal wasn't even 6 stories, as I recall. I think it was 4, maybe 5. But people in the neighborhood called it a skyscraper. When we talk about NIMBYs, it was the worst example of that. And it was negotiated because the neighborhood groups have a lot of power. And in the end, they negotiated it down to 3 stories. So in the part of that column where I talked about that building, I said it was made less contextual by making it 3 stories when it could have been 4 or 5 or probably should have been 6. And it's also a neighborhood with a lot of rising prices. So, building more units could have increased the supply and helped mitigate the price pressure that we're seeing. So that was that building. And then the 7-story building was in an old working class neighborhood, of which Philadelphia has many. And of course, they've gone upmarket. They've been gentrified. But this was a very, still very mixed neighborhood of 2- and 3-story townhouses, this very intimate, cozy quality that Philadelphia has. And one of the interesting things about Philadelphia is these row house neighborhoods grew up, around the factory. There'd be a big factory building where everybody worked, or there'd be a church. Everyone went to the same church. And that's one of the wonderful things about Philadelphia neighborhoods, were these institutional and civic and business centers. Anyway, so there was a beautiful old factory building, quite big, in the midst of this very low row house neighborhood. But the factory building was the same material, red brick. And so you didn't really mind that it was so much bigger than the houses. And of course, everyone was used to it. And it could have easily been retrofitted, this old factory building, because there are, dozens and dozens in Philadelphia that have been turned into apartments. But for reasons that are unclear to me, the developer wanted to level the whole thing. And I'm talking about a full city block, and build this 7-story building clad in metal panels and very unartfully designed, if you could use the word designed. It was, just one of these developer specials. So in that column, I compared the two things, one that was trying to look like the things around it, and one that was, totally alien. I mean, I didn't really mind the height or the number of units, or maybe some of the residents did, but I just felt the size combined with the materials, combined with the lack of architectural detailing, just made it such a terrible intruder into this neighborhood. So that was an attempt to talk about design and density and neighborhood input. And it's a very polarized time, not just in Philadelphia, but nationally. There's a lot of debate about this issue of density and housing affordability.
And of course, at different ends of the spectrum too, you have issues of housing for the homeless, and where are you going to build that? And should cities be building for the homeless, because nobody seems to want these buildings in their neighborhoods?
Yeah.
Across the river from you is Camden, New Jersey.
Yeah.
Kind of the little brother that, has not been quite as successful.
I know.
It has a couple of things going for it. Like, I understand that the best cheesesteaks are found at Donkey's Place in Camden.
That may be. I'm not a cheesesteak eater, but, there are people who will consider those fighting words here.
Right. Well, I learned about it on The Goldbergs, the TV show.
Oh, is that right?
Where they praised Donkey's Place in Camden.
I know Donkey's Place. I know people really love it. There's a place called Max's in Philadelphia that a lot of people will claim has the best cheesesteaks. And then there are these 2 dueling cheesesteak places in South Philly. What are they called?
The ones that are right across the street from each other? I think.
They're 2 across the street from each other. Pat's Steaks and, oh gosh. I should get my husband. He's the cheesesteak eater. But, we're a great sandwich town. We have these porchetta sandwiches. I like them better.
I understand that you and I share an affinity for Bjarke Ingels. He did a very nice building at the Navy Yard.
Yes. You like Bjarke.
I do.
Okay. Because a lot of critics do not like him.
I've seen that. Yes.
I have seen his other buildings. I've seen all the criticism of him. Some of it is valid, but he's very creative. He's very playful. And a couple years ago, the master developer for the Navy Yard, which is our old shipbuilding area, being redeveloped as a sort of denser version of the office park. And one of the things that master developer has been doing is trying to get higher quality architecture there as kind of a calling card. I think that developer also was trying out Bjarke for perhaps a larger project. Anyway, hired him to do basically a 4-story spec office building something that could be really banal, in some suburban office park. But he designed a very clever building that looks like a crashing wave. And it is a 4-story spec office building, but he just gave it a little pizzazz. Photographers and Instagrammers love to photograph it because of the parabolic curve.
Right.
The way the building curves, it seems to be like falling over. But
that's one of his signature moves, in buildings.
Yeah. What's clever about it, though, is, as they say, the per square foot cost was only slightly higher than your standard banal office building. So he was able to come up with a way of building it that was not that much more expensive than the norm. And yet it's way more exciting than the norm and just fun. And James Corner's firm, the landscape architect, designed a circular park in front of it. And there's a bunch of buildings that surround the park. So the building really responds to the circle of the park. The other intriguing thing about it, in the lobby, he used these mirrors to create a camera obscura, where you look up into the mirrors and it's like a periscope and you can see the old naval ships that are in dry dock.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's amazing. Because there's still some shipbuilding there.
Giant cranes, I know I see going down the highway.
Yeah. So you can see the ships. So the building's actually a couple blocks from where the docks are, the dry docks. But it connects the building to this naval business center, as they call it, to its shipbuilding past, but connects it not in the ways we usually think of, like imitating, the style of the past. But when you come in, you see where you are.
What do we have to look forward to in Philadelphia in the next couple of years? What's going up that's exciting you?
Well, there's a lot of housing being built. And one of the big themes of the last 20 years of my tenure here has been this nonstop housing boom of, new townhouses, new apartment buildings. There's a Rogers and Stirk. They're building an apartment building here. I don't think it'll be terribly special, but there's a bunch of high-rise apartment buildings going up. Herzog and Demeron have designed a small museum to house Alexander Calder's work.
Okay.
Calder's from Philadelphia, and both his father and grandfather were sculptors in Philadelphia who designed a lot of civic work in the city. And so there's been an effort. It's been going on more than a decade to build this museum. Tadeo Ando was the original architect, and then that effort fell apart. Now they have this other design, which I have not seen, but that would be located on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which is this Beaux-Arts, very green parkway that connects the City Hall with the Philadelphia Art Museum. And it has a lot of symbolic meaning in the city's history. It would be quite close to the Barnes Foundation, which was designed by Todd Williams and Billy Chen. So to have Herzog and Demeron across the street would be fun. I don't know if that's ever going to see the light of day, though. And there's a lot of parks being refurbished. We just had a big competition to redesign this Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which, as I said, was this Beaux-Arts City Beautiful effort, but has always been problematic. There's a big discussion about, should we put more buildings on it? One of the finalists in that competition wanted to turn it into an urban forest. It's right downtown. That firm didn't get picked. So that's a big project. I mentioned the waterfront. We are getting closer and closer to capping part of I-95, which would connect the historic colonial streets of what we call Old City back to the waterfront. It's a cap. There won't be really buildings on it, but there will be a big park.
Green space, yes.
A green space, yeah, with maybe some small park pavilions. Recently, a master developer was chosen for this sort of cursed piece of land called Penn's Landing, which is right next door to this cap. The Durst organization from New York, out of New York, was chosen.
They hire Bjarke Ingels quite a lot.
Do they? Yeah. Well, I wouldn't be surprised to see him. It's one of those long, slow-moving things, but it's been like a decade in the making, choosing a master developer. And so they chose Durst, and they had a master plan showing a bunch of towers and streets, which would further reconnect the waterfront back to the downtown. Despite all the problems with our waterfront, we are seeing a tremendous amount of construction along the Delaware and along the Schuylkill River. We have two rivers, the Schuylkill and the Delaware. And the Schuylkill is much narrower. And for years and years, Philadelphia was obsessed with creating a neighborhood along the Delaware, and we failed miserably. Meanwhile, while we sort of weren't looking, the Schuylkill has really blossomed. Our downtown is kind of like the activity is kind of shifted west toward the Schuylkill. And then on the other side is the University of Pennsylvania.
Inga, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you and meet you. And I hope that we can go over to Donkey sometime if I come up to visit.
I'll take you to all the hot spots.
Okay.
All right, George. It's wonderful to talk to you.
That was George Smart talking to Inga Saffron of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And now a few minutes with TikTok design critic Louisa Whitmore.
I'm Louisa Whitmore, and today I want to talk about the house in the museum garden. Marcel Breuer designed this modernist home as the ideal for a suburban family in 1949. The Museum of Modern Art actually commissioned the house in the museum garden in an attempt to respond to the post-war housing crisis in the U.S. It was designed with accessible materials like plywood, and while visiting the house, people could learn how it was constructed and the various expenses so that the home could be reproduced by contractors. The house was affordable, supposed to cost no more than $25,000 or about $290,000 in today's money, and it was also expandable? Breuer designed it so that part of the house could stand alone as a two-bedroom home that could be renovated to add more bedrooms as families grew. It's not a massive house, but the design is very open. Most of the rooms open on to one or two other rooms, and all of the rooms, except for the children's bedrooms, have doors to the outside, and several have giant walls of windows. There is also no wall between the master bedroom and the living room, just a small balcony with a rope railing because the master bedroom is on a higher level. It's not the most private, but I think sitting on your bed and looking down at people sitting in your living room would be it'd be pretty cool. The plan for the house is that it would be on display in the MoMA's Sculpture Garden as an educational tool from April to October 1949, and then it would be demolished. Except it wasn't demolished. Instead, it was bought by the Rockefeller family, who dismantled it and shipped it to one of their vast estates where it was used as a guest house. And I do find it at least slightly ironic that this ideal of the modernist home for the middle-class family was bought by one of the richest families in America, if not the richest. The house's post-museum life is also pretty interesting because it had to be dismantled, split into 4 pieces to be more exact, to travel to Pocantico Hills, New York, where it still resides. Putting it back together led to some changes. There were renovations done to it, things like expanding the garage, adding walls to enclose the kitchen, one of those open rooms, and changing the interior design, carpets and floors and things like that. In 2007, the National Trust for Historic Preservation took ownership of the house, and it has since been restored to almost exactly how it was designed in 1949. They've worked to put the garage back to its usual size, remove walls, and most impressively, find late 1940s appliances, like a fridge, for example, that were included in the original design. I cannot believe that would still work, but apparently it does. But there is one detail that I find super interesting for no reason. There is one feature of the house that has remained for 70-odd years, even though it wasn't part of the design. And it's the vents. The whole house has a ventilation system that was not part of the design, that was used to keep the place cool during the hot summer in New York 1949. The house didn't have power at the time because it was basically just a scaled-up model, so they needed these vents for temperature regulation, and they weren't in the design or the instructions for people to learn from, which means that this home, though it has been almost exactly replicated, will always be one of a kind. And I think that's pretty sweet. Also, it does still have marks from when it was cut into 4 pieces.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. And by Modernist Realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, let's go.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue millennial archivist Carrie Cesarino is fully amidst life's intergenerational realization that yes, we become our parents, as she and her shockingly handsome husband Adam raise 2 Generation Alphas. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild, Senior Boomer in Charge. George and I'll be back soon with another Get Those Kids Off My Damn Lawn Pulitzer Prize eligible edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.